My gym buddy kept saying my girlfriend was constantly checking him out. He melted down when she confronted him in front of everyone. I met Derek Whitmore at Ironside Fitness on a January morning when the New Year's resolution crowd still packed every machine. He asked if I was done with the bench press, and we ended up spotting each other through our sets. He was 32, 3 years older than me, with the kind of build that came from years of consistent work rather than genetics. We fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. He knew when to push me and when to back off. Our training sessions became the best part of my day, that pure focus where nothing existed except the weight and the movement. Derek had this way of reading people, understanding exactly what they needed to hear. When I struggled through my last rep, he'd say something that made me find strength I didn't know I had. Within 2 months, we were meeting 5 days a week, our schedules synchronized perfectly. I trusted him completely. He'd share stories about his corporate job and marketing, complain about his demanding boss, ask advice about his dating life. It felt like genuine friendship, the kind where you could be vulnerable without judgment. Alexis came into my life 3 months before I met Derek. She worked as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic, so she understood the dedication that went into training. She had dark curly hair that she usually wore in a messy bun, and this laugh that started quiet, then built until it filled whatever room she was in. We moved in together after 6 months, which everyone said was too fast, but it felt right. She got home before me most days and would have dinner started, and I'd tell her about my workout while she told me about her patients. She never came to Ironside with me. She spent her days around fitness equipment and injured athletes, she said, so the gym was the last place she wanted to be on her own time. I understood that. Everyone needs their own space. Derek knew I had a girlfriend, but they'd never met. I kept my gym life and my home life separate. That separation felt healthy, like different parts of myself could exist without overlap. Alexis would joke that Derek was my gym wife, the person who saw me at my most exhausted and sweaty, and I'd laugh because it was true in a way. He was my training partner, my accountability buddy, someone I depended on for that specific part of my life. The first comment came in late March. Derek and I were doing cable flies, and he said, "Your girlfriend sounds amazing, man. You're lucky." Normal enough. I agreed, wiped sweat from my face, and moved to the next set. But then he added, "She must be really attractive." The way he said it made me pause. Not a question, more like a statement he wanted me to confirm. I said, "Yeah, she was beautiful," and left it there. He smiled and nodded slowly, this odd expression I couldn't quite read. We finished the workout, but something about that exchange stuck with me. It wasn't what he'd said exactly, more the energy behind it, like he was fishing for something. I pushed it aside. Guys talk about their girlfriends at the gym. It wasn't weird. But over the next few weeks, he brought up Alexis more often. Casual questions about what she looked like, what she wore, whether she ever talked about coming to watch me train. I kept my answers brief, increasingly uncomfortable with where these conversations went. Derek would probe deeper, asking about her work schedule, what route she took home, what grocery store she used. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, trying to know more about my life. I didn't recognize it as reconnaissance. Then one evening in mid-April, Derek dropped the bomb. We were cooling down after a heavy leg day, stretching near the windows that overlooked the parking lot. He said, "I think I saw your girlfriend yesterday." I asked where. He gestured vaguely toward the street outside. "She drove past. Silver SUV, right?" I confirmed Alexis drove a silver Nissan. He nodded slowly, that same strange smile from before. "Yeah, I thought that was her." She slowed down when she passed the gym. I was walking to my car, and I swear she was looking right at me. I felt my stomach tighten. I asked if he was sure. He shrugged, but his eyes were bright with something I couldn't name. "Pretty sure, man. She did a double take. It was interesting." I tried to laugh it off, said she probably didn't even notice him. Maybe she was just looking at the gym. But Derek shook his head. "Nah, it was definitely me she was looking at. Trust me, I know that look." He said it with absolute certainty, like he'd studied the interaction, memorized every detail. The confidence in his voice made it harder to dismiss. I didn't mention it to Alexis that night. What would I even say? My gym buddy thinks you were checking him out while driving past. It sounded absurd, but the seed of doubt was planted. And Derek knew exactly how to water it. Over the next 2 weeks, he mentioned 3 more instances. Once at the coffee shop 2 blocks from our apartment, where he claimed Alexis had been in line behind him and kept staring. Once at the grocery store where he said she'd been in the produce section and definitely recognized him, even though they'd never met. And once more in the parking lot where she'd allegedly circled past slowly while he loaded equipment into his truck. Each story was detailed enough to be believable, but vague enough that I couldn't verify it. I started feeling sick every time he brought it up. This toxic combination of confusion, anger, and something worse. The creeping possibility that maybe he was telling the truth. He'd describe what she was wearing, and I'd remember her leaving the house in those exact clothes. He'd mention a time, and it would align with her schedule. The accuracy of the peripheral details made the central claims seem more credible. The thing about Derek's claims was how he presented them. Never accusatory toward Alexis, always sympathetic toward me. "I'm only telling you because you're my boy," he'd say. "I wouldn't want to be kept in the dark if I were you." He'd put his hand on my shoulder, genuine concern in his voice. "I know this is uncomfortable, man. I debated whether to say anything, but you deserve to know what's happening." That's what made it so insidious. He positioned himself as my protector, the honest friend brave enough to deliver hard truths. And I wanted to believe he was wrong, wanted to trust Alexis completely, but doubt is a poison that spreads. I found myself watching her differently. When she checked her phone, I wondered who she was texting. When she mentioned running errands, I questioned where she'd really been. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. The worst part was that our relationship seemed perfectly normal. She was affectionate, attentive, happy. There were no signs of anything wrong, which meant either Derek was lying or Alexis was an incredible actress. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Derek started offering advice on how to handle the situation. He suggested I pay more attention to her behavior, watch for signs of emotional distance, maybe check her phone when she wasn't looking. He framed it as protecting myself, being smart, refusing to be naive. "You're a good guy," he'd say. "You deserve honesty. If she's got wandering eyes, you need to know before you waste more time." He even recommended apps that could track her location, monitor her social media activity, see who she was communicating with. At the time, these suggestions felt like support. Looking back, I realized he was grooming me to become paranoid, to violate Alexis's privacy, to transform into someone she couldn't trust. He was systematically poisoning our relationship while positioning himself as my only reliable ally. And it was working. I became withdrawn, irritable, suspicious. Alexis noticed the change but attributed it to stress at work. She tried to be supportive, which only made me feel worse because I was keeping secrets from her, doubting her without giving her a chance to defend herself. I finally asked her about it one night in early May. We were on the couch watching a movie, and I said, as casually as I could manage, "Do you ever drive past my gym?" She looked confused. "Ironside? Not really." "Why?" I said I thought I'd seen her car. She shook her head. "I don't think so. My clinic is in the opposite direction, and I usually take the highway home." I pressed a little, asked about the coffee shop, the grocery store. She grew increasingly puzzled. "Are you asking if I'm following you or something? Because that would be really weird?" She laughed, but I could see concern in her eyes. I backtracked, said I must have been mistaken, changed the subject. But later that night, while she slept, I lay awake wondering why Derek would lie about something so specific. There had to be a reason. People didn't make up elaborate stories without motivation. Unless the motivation was the story itself, the effect it had. I was starting to suspect Derek enjoyed this, the way it unsettled me, the power he gained by creating doubt. But I couldn't reconcile that suspicion with the friend I thought I knew, the guy who'd helped me increase my deadlift by 50 pounds, who'd listened when I talked about my father's death, who'd been there consistently for months. At the gym the next morning, Derek seemed different, more aggressive in his comments, less subtle. He mentioned seeing Alexis twice in 1 week, claimed she'd been at a restaurant where he was having dinner with clients, and had definitely been checking him out from across the room. I finally snapped. "How would you even know what she looks like, Derek? You've never met her." He smiled, this slow, satisfied expression that made my skin crawl. "You've shown me pictures, man, on your phone. Remember?" And he was right. I had, months ago, casually during conversation. But the way he said it, like he'd memorized every detail of her face, felt wrong. I told him I thought he was imagining things. His expression hardened. "I'm trying to help you and you're calling me a liar? That's how you treat your friends?" I apologized, said I was just stressed. He accepted it, but the damage was done. The dynamic between us had shifted. What had been partnership now felt like something else, like a game I hadn't realized we were playing. The rest of our workout was tense, silent except for the necessary communication about sets and reps. The incidents escalated. Derek started texting me photos when he claimed to see Alexis. Blurry shots of parking lots or storefronts with captions like, "She was just here," or "Guess who I ran into?" The pictures never actually showed her, just locations. But he'd describe in detail what she'd been wearing, how long she'd supposedly watched him, what her expression had conveyed. It was gaslighting in its purest form, and I was falling for it. I became paranoid. I'd check Alexis's location sharing obsessively, correlate her movements with Derek's reports, search for discrepancies. There never were any. She went to work, came home, ran normal errands. Nothing matched Derek's timeline, which meant he was lying. But why? What could he possibly gain from tearing apart my relationship? I started researching narcissistic behavior patterns, manipulation tactics, toxic friendship signs. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Derek was deliberately destabilizing me for his own psychological satisfaction. I read about people who derived pleasure from creating chaos in others' lives, who felt powerful by controlling emotional narratives, who needed to prove they could influence and dominate those around them. I made a mistake. In my paranoid state, I installed a tracking app on Alexis's phone without telling her. I justified it as necessary, as protecting myself, but I knew it was a violation. I needed proof, one way or another. For 2 weeks, I monitored her every movement. She went exactly where she said she'd go, stayed exactly as long as she mentioned. No unexplained stops at Ironside, no circling the parking lot, no coffee shop visits that coincided with Derek's reports. The evidence was irrefutable. Derek had been lying about everything. But instead of relief, I felt a different kind of fear. Because if Derek was fabricating an entire fictional narrative about Alexis, what else was he capable of? And more importantly, why? I started paying closer attention to him at the gym, studying him the way he'd been studying me. I noticed things I'd missed before. How he watched other men's girlfriends when they came to visit. How he made comments about women that sounded admiring but had an edge of resentment. How he seemed to enjoy creating discomfort, thrived on the subtle power plays between people. I saw him corner another regular in conversation, watched the guy's face shift from friendly to uncomfortable to trapped as Derek talked at him for 20 minutes without pause. One evening at the gym, I saw Derek talking to another regular, Marcus Brennan. Marcus looked upset, shaking his head, and Derek had that same sympathetic expression he'd used on me. Later, I approached Marcus in the locker room, asked if everything was okay. He looked at me, conflicted, then said, "Man, I don't know. Derek said he saw my fiancée at the bar last weekend, acting really friendly with some guy. But she was out of town visiting her sister. I know she was. I called her that night." My blood went cold. "Did you tell Derek she was out of town?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, he apologized, said he must have been mistaken. But now I can't stop thinking about it, you know? Like, what if she wasn't really at her sister's?" I told Marcus about my own experience with Derek, watching his face shift from confusion to anger to recognition. We weren't the only ones. Derek had been running this same play on multiple people, systematically poisoning relationships for sport. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me text exchanges with Derek, messages that seemed supportive on the surface but were actually deepening his paranoia, encouraging him to doubt, to investigate, to become the kind of suspicious partner his fiancée would eventually leave. Marcus and I compared notes over the next hour. Derek had targeted at least 4 other guys at the gym with variations of the same story. Their girlfriends or wives were checking him out, showing interest, appearing in places too convenient to be coincidence. He'd even shown one guy text messages supposedly from his wife, messages the guy later confirmed were fabricated. Derek was sophisticated about it, never pushing too hard, always framing himself as the reluctant messenger, the good friend who cared too much to stay silent. The genius was in the ambiguity. He never claimed anything definitive, just observations that could be interpreted multiple ways, and he chose targets carefully, men in stable relationships, secure enough to be vulnerable to doubt. I felt sick realizing how perfectly he'd played me. But more than that, I felt angry. This wasn't just about me anymore. Derek was a predator, and he'd been operating unchecked for who knows how long. I had to tell Alexis. I had to warn her and figure out how to expose Derek for what he really was. That night, I deleted the tracking app from her phone and prepared to confess everything. My suspicions, my violation of her privacy, the manipulation I'd fallen victim to. When I told Alexis everything that night, I expected anger. Instead, she went very quiet, her face pale. Then she said, "I need to show you something." She pulled up her Instagram, scrolled through her message requests, and handed me her phone. There were dozens of messages from an account with no profile picture, name listed as DW. They'd started 3 months ago, right after Derek had begun his campaign. The messages were compliments at first, generic observations about her posts. Then they'd gotten more personal, comments about her appearance, questions about her relationship, suggestions that she deserved someone who appreciated her properly. The most recent one, sent 2 days ago, read, "I see you around sometimes. You're always alone. Does he even notice you anymore?" Alexis had ignored them all. Hadn't mentioned them because they seemed like typical creepy DM behavior, but seeing them now in context, they were clearly from Derek. He'd been grooming her while simultaneously trying to convince me she was pursuing him. The level of calculation was breathtaking. He'd been working both sides, trying to create a scenario where either I'd break up with Alexis out of suspicion, or she'd become vulnerable to his advances because I'd become distant and paranoid. Alexis started crying, not from fear, but from anger. "He tried to make me doubt myself," she said. "The messages got more specific. He mentioned things about us, about our relationship, things only someone close to you would know. I started wondering if you'd been talking to someone about us having problems. But we weren't having problems until recently." She looked at me with red eyes. "That was him too, wasn't it? He created the problems by putting doubt in your head." I nodded, feeling the weight of how completely Derek had manipulated both of us. He'd engineered a scenario where we'd pull apart from each other while he waited in the wings to offer comfort, support, maybe more. The sociopathic precision of it was terrifying. Alexis pulled up more messages, and we read through them together. In some, Derek positioned himself as a concerned observer who'd noticed I didn't treat her well enough. In others, he hinted at knowing secrets about me, suggested I wasn't faithful, implied he could show her proof if she'd just agree to meet him. Every message was crafted to undermine our relationship while making him seem like a trustworthy alternative. We stayed up until 3 in the morning, piecing together Derek's entire strategy. I showed Alexis the tracking data I'd collected, proving she'd never been anywhere near the locations Derek claimed. She showed me screenshots of every Instagram message, including ones where Derek had sent photos of our apartment building, our cars, places we frequented. He'd been surveilling us, gathering intelligence, building a comprehensive picture of our lives. Some messages referenced conversations I'd had with Derek at the gym, private things I'd shared about our relationship, my insecurities, my fears. He'd taken those confidences and weaponized them, using them to craft messages designed to exploit Alexis's vulnerabilities. One message said, "He told someone at the gym that you're too demanding, that you don't understand his need for space." I'd never said that, but it was close enough to something I'd mentioned about feeling overwhelmed at work that Alexis would believe it came from me. Derek had twisted my words, used them to drive a wedge between us. The sophistication of his manipulation was terrifying. Alexis wanted to confront Derek immediately. I told her we needed to be strategic. If we just called him out privately, he'd deny everything, maybe even flip the narrative somehow. We needed witnesses, needed to expose him in a way he couldn't manipulate his way out of. She agreed, but I could see the anger building in her, this coiled tension waiting to spring. We spent the rest of the night planning. I showed her pictures of Derek so she'd recognize him. We documented everything. His texts to me, the Instagram messages, statements from Marcus and the other guys he'd targeted. We had proof, but we needed the right moment. That moment came 3 days later, on a Saturday morning when the gym was packed. Weekend crowds were different, more casual members, more couples working out together, more social atmosphere. I texted Derek that I was running late but to start without me. Then Alexis and I drove to Ironside together. My heart was hammering as we walked through the door. I spotted Derek immediately, at the squat rack, focused on his form. Perfect. The gym was busy enough that whatever happened would have plenty of witnesses, but not so chaotic that we'd lose control of the situation. I approached Derek like it was a normal day, and his face lit up when he saw me. Then he noticed Alexis beside me, and something flickered across his expression. Surprise, calculation, a brief flash of what might have been fear. I introduced them casually. "Derek, this is Alexis. Alexis, Derek." She smiled, sweet and warm, and extended her hand. He shook it, and I watched him process the situation, trying to figure out what game we were playing. She said, "It's so nice to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you." Her tone was pleasant, friendly, giving him no indication of what was coming. Derek recovered quickly, that charming smile back in place. "All good things, I hope." She tilted her head. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. You've been saying some really interesting things about me to my boyfriend. And to me." She pulled out her phone, and I saw Derek's expression change, the charm dropping away to reveal something harder underneath. He glanced around, probably calculating whether he could walk away without making a scene. But we were positioned between him and the exit, and people were already starting to notice the tension. Alexis's voice carried across the gym floor, clear and calm. "For the past 3 months, you've been telling people I've been checking you out, following you around, showing interest in you." Other gym members were starting to notice, workouts pausing, attention shifting toward us. Derek held up his hands, that sympathetic expression sliding into place. "Whoa, I think there's been a misunderstanding." But Alexis cut him off. "No, there hasn't. You told him I circled your car in the parking lot, that I was staring at you at a coffee shop, that I did a double take when I drove past the gym. You sent him pictures of locations claiming I'd just been there." Her voice got harder. "You also sent me dozens of messages on Instagram from a fake account. Messages telling me I deserved better, that you noticed me, that I was always alone. Messages that got increasingly inappropriate when I didn't respond." The gym had gone completely silent now. Everyone watching. Derek's face flushed dark red. I never... You're making this up." His voice had risen, defensive, and I saw panic in his eyes as he realized his control of the narrative was slipping. Alexis turned to the crowd. "Anyone else here have a girlfriend or wife that Derek claimed was interested in him? Anyone else get told their partner was checking him out when they weren't even in town?" There was a long moment of silence. Then Marcus stepped forward. "He told me my fiancée was at a bar with another guy. She was 3 states away." Another man I recognized but didn't know by name spoke up. "He showed me fake text messages supposedly from my girlfriend." A woman near the weight rack said, "He told my husband I was flirting with him in the parking lot. I don't even know who he is." More voices joined in, a cascade of similar stories, all with the same pattern. Derek stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions, denial, anger, panic. When he finally spoke, his voice was too loud, edged with desperation. "This is bullshit. You're all ganging up on me because you can't handle the truth about your relationships." The desperation was morphing into something uglier now, the mask cracking completely. Someone pulled out their phone to record. Others did the same. Derek noticed, and his panic intensified. "You know what your problem is?" Derek was addressing me now, ignoring everyone else, pointing his finger like a weapon. "You're weak. You've always been weak. I tried to help you, tried to show you the truth about her, and you're too pathetic to see it." His voice was getting louder, more unhinged. "She is checking me out. All of you, your girlfriends, your wives, they see a real man and they can't help themselves." Someone laughed, a short bark of disbelief, and Derek whirled toward the sound. "You think this is funny? I'm better than all of you. I'm stronger. I work harder. I deserve more respect than this." He was breathing hard now, face twisted with rage. The gym manager, a woman named Kathleen Rivera, approached carefully. "Derek, I need you to calm down and leave the premises." He spun toward her. "You're going to kick me out? For what? For being honest? For trying to help these idiots see what's right in front of them?" His voice cracked on the last words, the composure he'd maintained for months finally shattering completely. This was the real Derek, the one he'd hidden behind charm and sympathy. Kathleen's voice was firm. "You've been harassing members and their partners. You're not welcome here anymore. Leave now or I'm calling the police." Derek looked around wildly, searching for allies, for anyone who believed him. He found only hostile faces. People pulling out their phones to record, others shaking their heads in disgust. The truth of his isolation seemed to hit him all at once. His expression crumpled, rage giving way to something that might have been genuine distress if it wasn't so self-pitying. "This isn't fair," he said, and his voice had gone high and thin. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to protect people. I was being a good friend." No one responded. The silence was damning. Derek's hands were shaking. He looked at me one last time, and I saw something in his eyes that chilled me. Not remorse, but hatred. Pure, undiluted hatred for being caught, for being exposed, for losing control of his carefully constructed game. In that moment, I understood that he'd never seen me as a friend. I'd been a mark, a target, entertainment for whatever dark impulse drove him. "You ruined everything!" Derek screamed it, and several people flinched. "I built this! I was respected here! And you—" He jabbed his finger at Alexis. "You don't even belong here! You've never even worked out here, and you waltz in and destroy everything!" Kathleen stepped between them. "That's enough! You need to leave, right now!" Two other gym employees, both large men who worked as trainers, moved closer. Derek must have realized he was outnumbered because he grabbed his bag from beside the squat rack, still muttering angrily. "You're all going to regret this. All of you. You don't know who you're messing with." It was such a cliché villain line that someone actually laughed, and that seemed to break something in him. He threw his water bottle at the mirror, watched it bounce off without shattering, then stormed toward the exit. At the door, he turned back. "This place is a joke anyway. You're all mediocre." Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the frame. The silence lasted another beat before someone started clapping. Others joined in, and suddenly the whole gym was applauding. Not for drama, but for exposure, for truth, for solidarity. The silence lasted about 5 seconds before everyone started talking at once. People clustered in groups, sharing their own Derek stories, comparing experiences. Kathleen approached us apologetically. "I'm so sorry this happened. If I'd known he was doing this, I would have banned him months ago." I asked if anyone had reported him before. She shook her head. He was good at keeping things subtle, I guess. People probably didn't realize there was a pattern. Marcus joined us, looking shaken but also relieved. "Thank you for doing this. I was starting to think I was going crazy." That's what Derek did best, I realized. He isolated people with their doubts, made each of us think we were the only one experiencing this. By exposing him publicly, we'd broken that isolation, showed everyone they weren't alone. But as the adrenaline faded, I felt oddly empty. Derek had been my friend, or at least I'd thought he was. I'd trusted him, relied on him, valued his presence in my daily routine. Learning it was all manipulation, left a void. Several other victims approached us over the next hour, sharing stories we hadn't heard, revealing the extent of Derek's operation. One man said Derek had convinced him his wife was having an affair, nearly destroyed a 15-year marriage before the truth came out. Another woman said Derek had targeted her brother, driven him to install spyware on his girlfriend's computer, caused a breakup that took years to recover from. We exchanged contact information with everyone who'd been affected by Derek's manipulation. By the time we left Ironside, we had a list of 12 people willing to document their experiences. Marcus, who worked in tech, offered to create a shared folder where everyone could upload evidence, screenshots, text messages, emails, anything that showed Derek's pattern of behavior. One woman, a lawyer named Rebecca Foster, suggested we consider filing a group complaint with the police. Individually, these might seem like misunderstandings, she explained, but together, they show a clear pattern of harassment and possibly stalking. That's actionable. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. As Alexis and I walked to the car, she was quiet. I asked if she was okay. She shook her head. I keep thinking about how close we came to falling for it. If you hadn't questioned things, if we hadn't talked to each other, Derek might have actually succeeded in breaking us up. I squeezed her hand. The reality of how calculated Derek's attack had been was still sinking in. Alexis and I left the gym after giving our statements to Kathleen and exchanging contact information with the other victims. In the car, Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, she said, "I keep thinking about those Instagram messages. How long was he planning this? How many other women did he target?" I didn't have answers. We'd exposed Derek, stopped him from continuing his games at Ironside, but we hadn't really understood him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying moments from our friendship, searching for signs I'd missed, wondering how I could have been so blind. At 2 a.m., I started Googling Derek Whitmore, trying to find information beyond what I already knew. It took digging, but eventually I found his LinkedIn profile, which led me to his previous employer, which led me down a rabbit hole I wished I could climb back out of. Derek had been fired from his last job at a corporate gym chain for inappropriate conduct with clients. The details were vague, but reading between the lines suggested he'd been accused of similar behavior, fabricating stories, creating drama, targeting women. This wasn't a new pattern. It was a refined technique he'd been perfecting for years. I kept digging. Found a Reddit thread from 2 years ago where people from his previous gym discussed that creepy trainer who tried to break up everyone's relationships. Found a blog post from a woman describing how a man, matching Derek's description, had stalked her after she rejected his advances at a fitness center. Found a court record showing he'd been issued a restraining order by a former coworker. The pattern went back at least 5 years, probably longer. Derek wasn't just a narcissist or a manipulator. He was a serial predator who used fitness communities as hunting grounds. He'd move from gym to gym, establish himself as a helpful, friendly regular, then systematically torture people for his own entertainment, or as revenge when women didn't return his interest. I felt sick reading it all, understanding how close we'd come to something much worse than what happened. If Alexis had responded to even one of his Instagram messages, if she'd agreed to meet him to talk about concerns regarding our relationship, what would he have done? The restraining order from his previous city had been filed by a woman who claimed Derek had broken into her home after she rejected him. The case had been settled, records sealed, but the basic facts were public. Derek had a history of escalation when he didn't get what he wanted. The next morning, I woke to 15 missed calls and twice as many texts. Derek had apparently spent the night on social media, posting from multiple accounts, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. He'd created elaborate stories about how I was abusive toward Alexis, and she was trying to escape, but too afraid to ask him for help. How the other gym members were covering for me because of some unspecified criminal activity. How Kathleen had a personal vendetta against him for rejecting her romantic advances. The lies were so outrageous, they should have been easy to dismiss, but he was skilled at crafting narratives that contained just enough truth to be believable. He posted photos of me and Alexis from social media, screenshots of innocent conversations taken wildly out of context, even fabricated text messages, supposedly showing me admitting to various wrongdoings. By noon, the posts had been shared hundreds of times. Some of Derek's followers, people who didn't know the real story, were calling for investigations, posting our personal information, threatening to expose the truth. I reported every account I could find, but new ones kept appearing. Derek had clearly prepared for this possibility, had backup accounts ready, a whole infrastructure for his smear campaign. Alexis was terrified. People had found her work address and were leaving negative reviews for her clinic, claiming she'd harassed them, that she was unprofessional, that she couldn't be trusted. Her boss called her in for a meeting, concerned about the accusations spreading online. I contacted a lawyer, who advised us to document everything and file for a restraining order, but warned that Derek could keep creating new accounts faster than we could get them taken down. The police were sympathetic but said, until Derek made an explicit threat or showed up physically, there wasn't much they could do. Online harassment is hard to prosecute, the officer explained, especially when he's technically just posting his opinions, even if they're false. We felt helpless. Derek had successfully turned his exposure into a new game, one where he maintained control by weaponizing the internet against us. Every hour brought new posts, new accounts, new accusations. Some were so specific they had to be coming from something. Records he'd stolen, information he'd gathered over months of our friendship. He posted about my salary, my family history, even medical information I'd shared with him in confidence. He knew exactly where to hit to cause maximum damage, and he was relentless. Alexis started having panic attacks. She'd check her phone compulsively, scrolling through the endless stream of hate directed at her, trying to respond to every false accusation. I had to physically take her phone away some nights, watch her cry from frustration and fear. Her work was suffering. Patients asked about the online reviews. Her colleagues looked at her differently. One coworker asked directly if she was involved in something illegal, based on Derek's posts. The professional reputation she'd spent years building was crumbling under the weight of Derek's lies. I felt responsible. If I'd never befriended him, if I'd recognized the manipulation sooner, if I'd protected our privacy better, none of this would be happening. Alexis assured me it wasn't my fault, but the guilt ate at me anyway. I'd brought this predator into our lives. I'd trusted him with personal information he was now weaponizing. Every new post felt like another failure on my part. Marcus called me 3 days into the harassment campaign. "I found something," he said. "Can you meet me?" We met at a coffee shop far from Ironside, somewhere Derek wouldn't know to look. Marcus had his laptop open, and he showed me what he'd discovered. He worked in cybersecurity, and he'd used his skills to trace Derek's various social media accounts. All the accounts posting about you connect back to the same IP address, he explained. But that's not the interesting part. That address shows up in connection with a dozen other harassment campaigns over the past 3 years. Different names, different gyms, but the same pattern. He finds someone, usually a couple, befriends them, then launches a coordinated attack when they figure out what he's doing. Marcus pulled up case files. 4 different police reports from 3 different cities, 2 restraining orders, a civil lawsuit that had been settled out of court. He's been doing this for a long time, and he's good at it. Most people just want it to stop, so they move away or change their routines, and he gets away with it. The documentation was damning, a clear pattern of predatory behavior spanning years and multiple jurisdictions. But Marcus had also found something more significant. One of Derek's previous victims, a woman named Jenna Lockwood from Austin, had documented everything, kept logs, screenshots, recordings. She'd tried to press charges, but the DA declined to prosecute due to insufficient evidence of imminent threat. However, she'd posted her entire experience on a website dedicated to exposing predatory behavior, with copies of all her documentation. If we can connect Derek's current behavior to his past pattern, Marcus explained, we might have enough for a criminal case, especially since he's now done this to multiple people in the same location. That shows intent, pattern, escalation. We contacted Jenna. She was wary at first, traumatized by her experience, but when we explained the situation and connected her with the other victims from Ironside, she agreed to help. Together, we compiled a case file that spanned 70 pages, documented harassment across 4 years, 8 different gyms, 23 identified victims. It painted a clear picture of calculated predation. Jenna told us her story, how Derek had befriended her boyfriend at a gym in Austin, created the same narrative of her checking him out, sent her similar Instagram messages, then escalated to showing up at her workplace when she rejected him. The boyfriend had believed Derek initially, and by the time the truth came out, their relationship was damaged beyond repair. The DA's office initially seemed uninterested. Harassment cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, and Derek hadn't made explicit threats or engaged in physical stalking. But then, Jenna's documentation revealed something crucial. Derek had violated the terms of his previous restraining order by moving to a new city and immediately resuming the same behavior. That made him a repeat offender, and it transformed the case from simple harassment to something more serious. The DA assigned an investigator, a woman named Detective Lisa Torres, who specialized in cyberstalking cases. She interviewed each of us separately, building a timeline of Derek's activities. What she uncovered was chilling. Derek had been maintaining detailed files on his targets: photos, personal information, social media history, work schedules, relationship details. He kept them organized by city and gym, updating them regularly, sometimes for months after he'd moved on. The investigator found the files on a cloud server Derek apparently thought was secure. It was a predator's archive, meticulous and disturbing. Some entries dated back 6 years. One folder contained photos of women taken without their knowledge, at grocery stores, coffee shops, walking to their cars. Another contained fabricated text message conversations he'd created as evidence to show suspicious partners. Detective Torres also uncovered Derek's methodology. He specifically targeted fitness communities because they attracted people in transition, individuals trying to improve themselves, seeking validation, building new identities. These people were vulnerable in ways that made them ideal marks. Derek would study them, identify relationship insecurities, then exploit those weaknesses with surgical precision. He kept notes on conversation patterns, emotional triggers, relationship dynamics. One file on me contained observations like responds to praise, seeks approval, conflict avoidant, uses exercise to manage anxiety, a psychological profile he'd built to better manipulate me. He'd done similar profiles on all his targets, treating relationship destruction like a science he was perfecting. Some files contained what appeared to be experiments, different approaches tried on different people, notes on what worked and what didn't. Detective Torres called it the most sophisticated harassment operation she'd encountered, scary in its calculated cruelty. Derek wasn't acting on impulse. He was a predator who'd found a niche and optimized his approach over years of practice. The detective also found evidence of financial motivation. Derek had been selling information about his victims to data brokers, marketing firms, even private investigators. Personal details, relationship vulnerabilities, psychological profiles. He'd commodified the intelligence he gathered through manipulation. Some files showed payments ranging from a few hundred to several $1,000s per detailed subject profile. He turned predation into a business model, with gym members as his unwitting product. The discovery added federal charges to his case: identity theft, wire fraud, illegal sale of personal information. What had started as a harassment investigation became a multi-agency operation. The FBI got involved, so did the Federal Trade Commission. Derek's operation was bigger and more organized than anyone had initially suspected. He had clients, repeat customers, who purchased his profiles for purposes ranging from targeted advertising to employment screening to who knows what else. The scope was staggering. The legal process moved slowly. Derek was arrested on charges of stalking, harassment, violation of a restraining order, identity theft, wire fraud, and illegal data trafficking. He posted bail immediately and continued his online campaign, now claiming persecution by a corrupt legal system. His followers rallied around him, organized protests outside the courthouse, sent threatening messages to anyone speaking against him. Some days it felt like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more appeared. But Detective Torres kept working. She connected Derek to 5 additional victims who hadn't been in our original documentation. She found evidence of identity theft, fraud, and even blackmail. Derek had been not just harassing people, but actively trying to destroy their lives, their careers, their relationships. With each new discovery, the charges multiplied. What started as a harassment case became something much larger, a RICO investigation into organized cyberstalking and fraud. Derek had apparently been monetizing his activities, selling personal information he'd gathered about his victims to data brokers. He'd created elaborate profiles on people, detailed psychological assessments based on his manipulation techniques, and marketed them as competitive intelligence to unscrupulous companies. The scope of his operation was staggering. The trial took 8 months to reach court. During that time, Alexis and I tried to rebuild our normal lives, but nothing felt normal. We moved to a different apartment, changed our routines, limited our social media presence. Alexis started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma of being targeted. I switched to a different gym, though I rarely went. The association was too strong, too poisonous. I gained weight, lost muscle, stopped caring about fitness. What Derek had twisted into a weapon felt impossible to reclaim as something positive. But slowly, with Alexis's support and my own therapy, I started to heal. I recognized that Derek's manipulation had exploited my trust, not exposed some flaw in me. That his ability to create doubt didn't mean the doubt was justified. That being a victim of psychological warfare didn't make me weak or foolish. Understanding that intellectually was one thing. Feeling it, believing it, was harder. But I was getting there. My therapist helped me understand that Derek had targeted me specifically because I was trusting, because I valued friendship, because I believed in people. Those weren't weaknesses to be ashamed of. They were qualities worth protecting, even after betrayal. The trial itself was surreal. Watching Derek in court, dressed professionally, speaking calmly to his lawyer, presenting himself as a reasonable person who'd been misunderstood, it was masterful acting. He'd dropped the rage, the desperation, the ugliness we'd seen during his meltdown. Instead, he was articulate, sympathetic, painting himself as a man whose friendly nature had been misinterpreted, whose honesty about what he'd observed had made him a target. On the stand, he described each incident with remarkable detail, twisting every fact just slightly to make himself the hero, us, the villains. He claimed I'd been abusive, and he'd tried to help Alexis escape, that she'd sent him messages begging for support, that the other gym members were part of a conspiracy, possibly connected to organized crime, and he'd been trying to expose them. The lies were so elaborate, so internally consistent, they might have been convincing if the prosecution hadn't presented the evidence of his previous victims, his files, his pattern of behavior. 23 people testified about their experiences with Derek. The cumulative weight of their testimony was devastating. The jury heard story after story of manipulation, harassment, systematic destruction of relationships. They saw the files Derek had kept, read the notes where he'd detailed his strategies, viewed the fabricated evidence he'd created. The prosecution also brought in a forensic psychologist who analyzed Derek's behavior patterns. She testified about predatory personality disorders, the specific psychology of someone who derives satisfaction from controlling and harming others. She explained how Derek's techniques were sophisticated forms of psychological abuse, designed to create maximum emotional damage while maintaining plausible deniability. She walked the jury through Derek's methodology step by step, showing how each action was calculated to isolate victims, create paranoia, and position Derek as the only trustworthy person in their lives. When she finished, several jurors looked visibly shaken. Derek's lawyer tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting it was speculative, but she'd built her analysis on documented behavior patterns, statements from victims, and Derek's own files. There was no speculation involved. Derek had documented his own predation in meticulous detail, apparently never imagining he'd be caught. The arrogance of that, the confidence that he was too smart to face consequences, was perhaps his biggest mistake. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts on 15 counts including stalking, harassment, fraud, identity theft, and illegal data trafficking, Derek's mask finally cracked again. He stood shouting at the jury, at the judge, claiming persecution, conspiracy, injustice. The bailiffs had to physically restrain him as he was led away. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison with required psychological evaluation and treatment. She also ordered him to pay restitution to each victim and placed a lifetime restraining order preventing him from contacting any of us. The judge's statement from the bench was powerful. You systematically targeted vulnerable people, exploited their trust, and commodified their pain. You showed no remorse, no understanding of the harm you caused. This sentence reflects not just what you did, but who you are. It wasn't everything. Some victims felt the sentence was too light, and Derek's online defenders still insisted he'd been railroaded. But it was something. It was accountability. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and I held Alexis's hand, feeling both triumph and exhaustion. We'd survived Derek's campaign. We'd exposed him, stopped him, ensured he'd face consequences for what he'd done. But the victory felt hollow in some ways. The damage had been done. Relationships had been destroyed. People had been traumatized. Derek going to prison didn't undo any of that. In the weeks following the verdict, something unexpected happened. Other victims from gyms and fitness communities across the country started coming forward with their own Derek stories. The trial had given them permission to speak, shown them they weren't alone. A support group formed. Resources were developed for recognizing and reporting similar predatory behavior in fitness spaces. Gyms started implementing better policies for handling harassment complaints. Derek's exposure became a catalyst for broader change, forcing conversations about manipulation, about the way trust can be weaponized, about the particular vulnerabilities that exist in spaces where people seek self-improvement. I started working with a nonprofit that helped victims of psychological abuse, sharing my experience, teaching others to recognize the warning signs. It gave me purpose, transformed my trauma into something constructive. Alexis and I grew stronger together, our relationship tested and proven resilient. We learned to trust again, both each other and ourselves. The experience had shown us what we were capable of surviving, the strength we had individually and together. Some couples might have been destroyed by what Derek did. We were forged stronger by it. I testified at a state legislative hearing about gaps in harassment law, particularly around psychological manipulation and cyberstalking. My testimony, along with that of other victims, contributed to new legislation that made patterns of harassment easier to prosecute, even when individual incidents didn't rise to the level of threats. The law was named after Jenna Lockwood, the victim from Austin who'd first documented Derek's methods. She'd become an advocate for victims of psychological abuse, turning her trauma into activism that would protect others. I admired her courage, her refusal to let Derek's actions define her life. Marcus started a database documenting predatory behavior in fitness communities, a resource where people could report incidents and search for patterns. It became a valuable tool for identifying serial manipulators before they could cause extensive damage. The gym community, which Derek had exploited so effectively, became the source of resistance against people like him. Ironside implemented new policies requiring background checks for anyone becoming a regular fixture at the gym, and Kathleen created training for staff on recognizing manipulation tactics. The nonprofit work became increasingly important to me. I met survivors of all kinds of psychological abuse, workplace manipulation, family gaslighting, romantic coercion. Each story was unique, but the patterns were familiar. Predators operated similarly across contexts, exploiting trust, creating doubt, isolating victims from support systems. I learned to recognize the signs earlier, help people understand what was happening to them before the damage became irreparable. Alexis joined me in the work eventually, using her background in physical therapy and understanding of body language to help identify when people were being manipulated. Together, we developed workshops for gyms, sports clubs, and fitness communities about recognizing predatory behavior. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of organizations wanted training. Hundreds of people shared their own experiences with manipulation in athletic spaces. We realized Derek wasn't an isolated case. He was one example of a widespread problem that had been invisible because victims were too ashamed or confused to speak up. 2 years later, I walked into a new gym for the first time since leaving Ironside. My hand shook as I approached the front desk, but Alexis squeezed my shoulder and reminded me I'd already faced something far scarier than free weights and treadmills. Inside, the familiar smell of rubber and sweat triggered memories, but they didn't have the same power anymore. I'd learned that evil often wears a friendly face, speaks with concern, offers help while quietly destroying. I'd learned that trust has to be earned through consistency, not charm, and that questioning manipulation isn't paranoia. It's wisdom. As I started my warm-up, I caught my reflection in the mirror and recognized something I hadn't seen in years. Not just my body returning to strength, but my sense of self, reclaimed from someone who'd tried to steal it. Derek was in prison, serving his sentence, reportedly still maintaining his innocence. His appeals had been denied. His online following had mostly abandoned him once the full extent of his crimes became public. But more than his punishment, more than any justice the system provided, what mattered was this. I was here, moving forward, refusing to let his poison define my future. The weight felt good in my hands. I was ready to lift again. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.